everyone. Welcome to our Underwater Heritage lecture series. Welcome to the Coastal Studies Institute. My name's Nathan Richards. I'm the program head of the Maritime Heritage program here at the Coastal Studies Institute. This series, I'd like to thank some sponsors. We are sponsored by the Outer Banks Community Foundation, who've provided some support to get these great lecturers here to talk about these topics. It's a collaboration with the Outer Banks Community Foundation as well as the Graveyard of the Atlantic Museum in Hatteras. For those of you that don't know, Will's talk tonight is a repeat of an 11 o'clock lecture that he gave down there this morning. So this is the same one, but this will also be streamed live. The other partners that we have with this initiative are the Program of Maritime Studies at East Carolina University. I should also note that the Maritime Museum is part of the Department of Cultural Resources. As I said, we have people watching online, and what we're going to do at the end of the presentation is we'll also have questions from people who are watching online. So if you can keep your questions till the end, we'll pass around the microphone and let everyone online hear your questions, and we'll get Will to answer them. But I won't talk too much more. I'd like to introduce Will Sassarosi. He's a master's candidate at the Program of Maritime Studies at East Carolina University. The title of his talk is Defending the East Coast, How Converted Vessels Helped to Win the Battle of the Atlantic. And this is the subject of his thesis. He's defending his thesis in 2 weeks. So if you could ask him really hard questions, that would be fantastic.
Not too hard. Well, thank you. Again, my name is Will Sassarosi, Maritime Studies graduate student at East Carolina University. And this is a presentation based off of my thesis, How Converted Vessels Helped to Win the Battle of the Atlantic during World War II. Just to introduce kind of the topics we're going to go over, first thing we're going to talk about are naval changes following World War I that definitely influenced the use of converted vessels. Then we'll get into a little history of the Battle of the Atlantic, especially off the east coast of the United States, directly following the bombing of Pearl Harbor and the months following that. And then I'll get into examples of the converted vessels from my thesis, but there are hundreds of converted vessels used at this time, but 3 examples that I target in my thesis, and the importance of these converted vessels. We'll wrap it up that way. So following World War I, hugely influential world event, dramatic in that economic costs were huge, loss of life. But what had led to this dramatic event? Over the years prior to World War I, there was a massive buildup between nations of one-upsmanship, of building bigger and better armies and navies, and it ultimately resulted in this cataclysmic event. So following its end, the victorious nations, the United States, the United Kingdom, Japan, France, and Italy came together with an idea of how to prevent future wars from happening of this scale. And so one of the things that they came up with was this Washington Navy Treaty. And this was signed in 1922. And the main idea I want everyone to take away from this is that it was a reduction of arms. The idea was to stop the arms buildup, specifically in Navy, put a moratorium on building battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and limit the size of standing navies. So the idea was to reduce and put it on a more level playing field, so there wasn't this arms race that had hugely influenced World War I. Another influence at this time was the United Kingdom reevaluated their response to U-boat attacks in their waters during World War I, and how they could fit under the Washington Navy Treaty, how to respond to these attacks against or from German U-boats or U-boats in general, submarines, in the future, and how to work within the restrictions of the Navy, the Washington Navy Treaty. And what they came up with was a modification of a fishing trawler, and that fishing trawler was the James Ludford. James Ludford was built in 1919, right after the war. It served a commercial purpose until it was bought out by the Royal Navy in 1933, and it was adapted for coastal patrol. This is what had been lacking by the British Navy during World War I. They identified the need for more coastal patrols to deal with U-boats. And so what they came up with was to convert already built commercial fishing trawlers. They served a purpose. They didn't need to be fast, and they could be converted easily. And in this image here, the conversions were relatively simple in nature. You add a deck gun at the bow, and there's no depth charges here at the stern, but that would be your second source of armament in converting these commercial vessels for military use. So, after the Washington Navy Treaty in 1922 was adopted, it went through several rounds of negotiations, and year after year, countries kind of fell by the wayside by agreeing to this treaty, and ultimately Japan leaves in 1936, and we have war begin anew on a large scale in Asia with Japan invading China. Shortly thereafter, Germany invades Poland in 1939. So we're falling down this rabbit hole of a large-scale war happening again. France and the United Kingdom shortly declare war on Germany. The United States is still on the sideline at this point as well. They want to remain neutral. But this 2-year period in between Pearl Harbor at the end of 1941 and the beginning of the war in Europe, 1939, is a very key period for the United States. They want to stay out and stay neutral, but we really don't. We are sending forces to the Allies, supplies, resources such as battleships, destroyers. We're called the arsenal of democracy. Without being fully involved, we're helping the Allies through this period, but it's siphoning off our own resources. So they're going to the British, going to the French. We don't necessarily have stuff in our home waters per se, because it's going to someone else. And also our focus from a naval strategy standpoint is focused in the Pacific. Our main forces are focused on a main adversary being Japan, rather than our forces being located mostly in the Atlantic. So a large majority of our forces are in the Pacific. So December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor is bombed. A lot of our resources are destroyed at Pearl Harbor, and soon thereafter, Germany declares war on us. So we have a two-ocean war immediately on our doorsteps. A lot of resources are being allocated from the Atlantic to go supply the Pacific fleet. But meanwhile, when this is happening, German U-boats are coming down into American waters by the end of December, early January, and to start full-scale war along our eastern seaboard. This is what I call our desperate times. By the end of June 1942, we have over 128 Allied and neutral vessels lost in our territorial waters, to a tune of only 6 U-boats being lost. And 2 of those U-boats were actually lost right off here in North Carolina, but as you can see, the vast disparity between the 2 casualties there. And worldwide, this is a figure I wanted to point out, that over 585 vessels had been lost in this 6-month span from January through June 1942, just showing the effectiveness of the German U-boat campaign. So what do we do to respond to the German U-boats? Well, the idea is to implement a convoy system for our merchant shipping. Unfortunately, this takes time to organize and implement, and ships don't necessarily always follow orders, and they go by the wayside, and sometimes they're off on their own. This is a picture of the Dixie Arrow that was torpedoed in March 1942. Between January and I would say April 1942 was the worst period of time for merchant shipping off the East Coast. There's over 60 identified vessels lost in North Carolina waters due to the German U-boat campaign. So getting back to what did we do, or what did the United States do to counteract this, the German advance, was to requisition any and all type of vessels. Anything that floated could be used in a military fashion. Motorboats, yachts, and specifically fishing trawlers were used. And so the U.S. Navy would take them in and convert them in a similar fashion to the James Ludford by adding armament, and specifically the deck gun and the depth charges. And so these vessels could be used for patrol and escort duty, and I'll get into why fishing trawlers are good for that here. They are already built. There's a large commercial fleet of fishing trawlers readily available, and this is what the United Kingdom identified early in the 1930s, that there is a already built source of vessels ready to be used and allocated for defense. And this is what the United States, they modeled this program again. So they could take in already built vessels. You don't have to worry about producing something new. The conversion process is relatively cheap and easy. They would take in World War I era type guns and add them to these fishing trawlers. They weren't necessarily the top-notch new weaponry that these trawlers were getting, but it was still effective in their use. And ultimately, this conversion could be considered temporary as well. The idea was eventually naval military produced crafts would be built and replace these converted vessels, and eventually they could go back to their commercial original use, fishing trawlers. Again, the design of a fishing trawler is good for patrol and escort duty. It doesn't need to be fast. It needs to be reliable and seaworthy, and this is what a fishing trawler is already capable of doing. Again, it also provides relief duty for destroyers and other military naval craft that can go off and do other operational duties, and this was a role that these converted crafts would fill. So the examples that I use in my thesis, I combine a historical record and an archaeological record, so you can see both aspects, but we're going to get into the examples of these three vessels that I use. Two of them are British origin, and they came over in February of 1942 in a reverse Lend-Lease. The situation was really dire in American waters at this time, and so the United Kingdom gave us a group of 24 converted fishing trawlers to use for anti-submarine patrols. And the other one I talk about is American-built. It had a very short commercial career, and then it went right into U.S. Naval service. So again, my thesis is combining this historical record with the archaeological record to see if the conversion and adaptation process is consistent between all three vessels, and also with that original design of the James Ludford, if that's considered that prototype design. So this is the area that we're talking about where, and spoiler alert, all three vessels were lost during the war. This is just emblematic of the example, just showing an example of what this type of vessel is. It's not showing that they were poor in quality, but just that we have a record of this type of conversion process in these three lost vessels. So showing right off of North Carolina waters at varying depths. We have the YP-389, which is originally named the Cohasset. That was the American-built vessel. And these two at the bottom, the HMS Senateur Duhamel and HMT Bedfordshire, are the two British trawlers. So Senator Duhamel, that's its original name, and this is its original use picture. It was built in 1927, and it's the largest of these three exampled vessels, at over 190 feet and 913 tons. It operated as out of France for a French fishing company, and that's why you see the French flag at the stern. And then in 1940, it was seized by the Royal Navy and became part of the British Patrol Service. You probably can't see that at the bottom, but it was converted right after it was seized in 1940 and worked in British home waters for patrol and escort service. And then it was transferred as part of this grouping over to the United States to operate in U.S. waters. So this is a picture of its converted stage. Comparing the two, two photos, I produced this model of what the original design would look like and the converted features. This green giant right here, the green represents what the original features of the vessel were, and the red are your converted features. So at the bow, you have a deck gun. It was a 4-inch deck gun that was added. And at the stern, depth charge rails were added. And this right here is what's called a Holman projector. It was basically a grenade launcher for anti-aircraft defense. And at the top here as well, we have aircraft parachutes. And I'll get into that as well. But you can see the majority of the vessel itself remained pretty much the same as its intended use. So again, these are features of the vessel that I pointed out: the deck gun. There were machine guns on the bridge on either side, the aircraft parachutes, the Holman projector, and the depth charge rails. Depth charge is, if anyone didn't know, you set the charge itself for a certain depth, and it would be rolled off the back, off the stern, and at that design depth, it would explode. And you have to kind of guess where the submarine might be, and that's a guessing game for a lot of these vessels. And then also right next to the rails are these two depth charge throwers. They basically throw the depth charge off the side, either side. So what is the aircraft parachute? These are kind of designs that didn't necessarily work, but they were put in nonetheless just to aid in defense against aircraft. These are actually two pictures of the Bedfordshire, but to explain what they are, there's these two poles here, or this pole here, and it would shoot out a 400-foot wire cable if a plane was coming by to try to snag it and bring it down that way. And I don't have a recorded success on that at all, but I was there nonetheless. And this is the Holman projector, which is basically a pneumatic tube. It was foot depressed, and it would shoot off a grenade into the air. Also a lucky chance type hit if it works. If it didn't, it didn't. But for Duhamel, there was not a known instance where it was dealing with an aircraft, so they didn't have to deal with that. Just a little bit about the vessel itself. It operated out of Morehead City. This, again, is in its converted stage, where we clearly see the deck gun, the rails, the depth charge rails at the stern, and the Holman projector is up in here. It sank due to a collision with the destroyer USS Sims on May 6, 1942. No loss of life, but unfortunately it was lost to a collision of this nature. So in the archaeological record, I know it's a little dark, and that's the nature of these photographs anyways. It's really hard to see. In 2012, NOAA Bow, the Atlantic expedition, went back and did a photo recon of the site. It's been heavily picked over. It sank in 65 feet of water, and it was considered a navigational hazard, so it was dynamited and wire dragged, so there's really not that much left. But evidence that was able to be identified, this is the stem post that's at the bow. This is what we think is the part of the deck gun mount. And this is one of the large boilers, one of the two large boilers that remain. And in this multi-beam sonar data, what we're seeing here is the outline of the ship remains, the vessel remains. And basically you're looking at the variance in color. This dark blue, purple is representing a deeper elevation on the sea floor. And this red area, these are the two boilers. These are sticking up higher up off the water. So we're looking, you can see the outline, still not that much left of the vessel, but we think there is the remains of the deck gun mount in that archaeological evidence. And so I recreated a model based off of what I could interpret off of the photographic and the sonar data. This is what we came up with. Again, the boilers, not much, gun mount up here, and the reserve coal bunker and tunnel that would serve feeding the the boilers and the engine. So moving on to the Bedfordshire, it was built in 1935. I do not have an original picture of what it looked like in its commercial service, but this is some of the crew and a cutaway model of the starboard side at the bottom here of what it most likely looked like in its original design, and a little aerial view from the port side, again at the top. It was in service pretty much immediately at the beginning of World War II, sold right to the Royal Navy in October 1939, so only a couple years of commercial service. It is in the converted state. Again, we're seeing the large deck gun, a 4-inch deck gun at the bow, and the depth charge rails at the stern. These are also features up here that I'll get to that are converted armament features. Another thing that you're not seeing in these models, but also needs to be mentioned, in the conversion process, you're adding crew space and adapting for the fish hold to be removed and added weight and ballast, with including spare depth charges and spare ammunition need to be accounted for. So what I'm just showing you is the exterior features that are changed in the modification process. So HMT Bedfordshire worked in British waters until 1942, when it and the Senator Duhamel, among the group of 24, came over to work and operate in U.S. coastal waters in 1942. Here's that green imagery again, where we're picking out what is original use and what is converted military use. Again, the majority is green, with the main features being your deck gun converted, your depth charges at the stern. There was a covering for the compass house added, and a searchlight, as well as you have your aircraft parachutes. And this is a Holman projector here, and in this area we have it's called a Vickers machine gun. There's two of them. I think it's 50 cal, and it's located right above the galley. And again, this is identifying those features without the green parachutes, machine guns, and it also had depth charge throwers on either side, port and starboard, the stern. It also operated out of Morehead City. This one, Bedfordshire, sunk immediately due to a torpedo strike from U-558 while on patrol duty. A sad little footnote to this grouping: the night before it went out, before it sunk, Sam Nutt, a British sailor, was thrown in the Morehead City jail due to drunkenness, and he was there overnight while the rest of the crew went out, and he was the only survivor of this vessel because it was totally lost. There's actually a gravesite in Ocracoke commemorating 4 of the sailors that had washed up on the beach, and that's a cemetery dedicated to British sailors there. In 2009, NOAA, as part of the Battle of the Atlantic expedition, went back and did a full site survey, a full site plan of this wreck site. And again, some of the features that are available that we can see in a little clearer water. This is a depth charge and a trawl winch. Again, you're going to see this duality of military conversion, but still the commercial aspects, because it, again, was intended for temporary use. You don't want to fully strip it of its commercial aspects. And again, at the top left, we have the remnants of the deck gun mount. So this is the full site plan that was recorded. It's really hard to see from where you're sitting. But again, this is a depth charge that is located probably in this area right here towards the stern. Again, I created a 3D model of the site remains, showing the deck gun mount that is at the bow. and the depth charges that remain. So again, we can see evidence of the military conversion process within the archaeological record. Moving on to Cohasset, the last of the three selected vessels. This is the smallest of the three, only 110 feet in length. It was one of 4 similarly built vessels that came out of Quincy, Mass. And 3 of those 4 actually served in the U.S. Navy. And they were all similar designations I'll get to. But this is part of its building process on the slip and then going into the water. It's only served a commercial purpose for 4 months before it was taken in by the U.S. Navy. And this is it prior to getting converted at the Brooklyn Naval Yard. So it was its first designation following the conversion process. It was actually a minesweeper, but then it got redesignated as a yard patrol craft. This is where the YP comes from. And it was converted again in Brooklyn. But its 2 other vessels, sister vessels, were YP 388 and YP 387. Very similar in title. So in this recreation of the converted process, it's even less dramatic than some of the British vessels. You only really see the deck gun, the depth charge rails, and 2 machine guns that were added to the vessel. Internally, you do have altered crew space and to make way for ammunition, but exterior, you still have your main trawl winch, lifeboat, and trawl gallows that remain as part of your commercial vessel. Again, this is just showing the converted areas at the bow and the stern, the 2 machine guns. Its fate, it was lost due to a interaction with U-701. It was actually a surface gun battle between the 2 that lasted over an hour. And in that scenario, the submarine won. Ultimately, U-701 was lost, I think a couple weeks later. But the YP-389 put up a good fight. Only lost 6 out of 24 crew members. And this one was sunk in deeper water. It's at 320 feet, a little bit away from either commercial activities or recreational diving, but the remains of the site are very well intact. We can see it's basically sitting straight up, and this is the deck structure here with the framing that you can see, almost like a skeleton. So in the remains, we were able to identify the deck gun and a deck gun mount that's behind it. And at the stern, we weren't able to necessarily see any depth charges, but if you're going through the it's not activity report, but within the activity report, all the depth charges were let loose in the gun battle. So there most likely wouldn't be any depth charges anyways. This is as a result of ROV footage that during the 2009 Battle of the Atlantic expedition, when we were able to get good photographic and video evidence of the propeller and, again, the trawl winch. So you're seeing that commercial aspects within a military craft. And so the 3D model, much more intact. You can see the winch, the deck gun mount, and deck gun itself at the bow. And there would be evidence of the depth charge rails at the stern. So in concluding what my thesis really was able to identify, there was a match between the historical and archaeological record, that there was this military conversions that was consistent throughout each of the vessels. But going back to the original question, how did these vessels really help in winning the Battle of the Atlantic? By producing these converted crafts and getting them on the water, they ultimately altered the U-boat strategy, keeping them underwater, not allowing them to freely move around at night. And it was in conjunction with air support and then ultimately the convoy vessels. But again, the strength in numbers ultimately turned the tide in winning the war for the United States and moving German U-boats off of the eastern seaboard. So I want to give thanks to East Carolina University and the Maritime Studies Program, the NOAA Monitor Sanctuary, and CSI, and a lot of archival help from the National Archives in the US and the Royal Museum in London. So thank you.
We've got time for questions. Would anyone like to ask a question?
I got a question.
Let me pass the microphone around as we...
Did all those ships use coal for fuel only?
The two British vessels were originally coal-fired, and they were coal, that's what they used. The YP-389 was actually diesel-powered.
Okay.
So the two British vessels were, yes, indeed,
Because
coal-powered.
all the German subs had to be diesel, they weren't
They
coal.
were, I'm pretty sure that those were diesel. But yeah, the YP-389 was relatively new, and they had a diesel engine.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Did you dive any of these sites yourself?
Unfortunately, no, I didn't. Those were all archival photographs with the help of John McCord, and Dr. Richards was actually in one of those, some of those pictures. But through NOAA, they were able to. I already had the base for the archaeological photographic evidence, but I will be going back very shortly to dive at least the Bedfordshire.
So are the sites being investigated still now with people actually diving them?
The Senator Duhamel is not necessarily a popular diving site, but it's within recreational diving limits, as well as the Bedfordshire.
No, that was the one, like, one was 35 feet, one was
The
like 60.
Senator Duhamel is at 65 feet, so
And
it's
one was
well within
105,
recreational
gotcha.
diving limits. But the visibility is not always great, so it's not terribly popular.
Yeah.
But Bedfordshire is also within recreational diving limits, so you can go charter boats to get to them, and definitely want to do that. The YP-389 is outside of recreational diving limits. You'd have to really get some tech certification to go
Sure, yeah.
down to that one. And so that's why the ROV was used to get research from that.
Are there other boats that haven't been, or are there other boats off the coast that weren't a part of this talk that were the, go ahead.
Absolutely, no, absolutely. There's over 60 merchant vessels that were lost, and only a few have ever been dove on and recorded in the same manner that the Bedfordshire was, with a full site plan. The Monitor National Marine Sanctuary is going to go back this summer. This has been an ongoing series since 2008 to document vessels of this period. In 2008, it started with the U-boats, and then moving in the last couple of seasons, it's been focused on different commercial vessels and the converted vessels. And so this season, it's a continuation of these research projects that has been able to be done through the NOAA Monitor Sanctuary, and in conjunction with CSI and BOEM, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. So yeah, we're going back again to see a lot of these vessels. And then there's also World War I vessels the research
World
is.
War I, too?
There's two
Well, I guess Civil
that
War
I know
as well.
of, and there's Civil War. There's the interesting thing about North Carolina diving in itself. There's an age range of any interest. There's Civil War wrecks, World War I wrecks, World War II wrecks that are available for anyone really to dive. So it's nice diving.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Different direction, and this might be outside of the research that you did, but the boats, how were they requisitioned? Were they purchased?
They were purchased, yeah. If I didn't make that clear, I apologize. They were purchased. They were either donated for some financial compensation, almost like purchase, but a lot of them were just bought outright by the Navy and then either given back or sold back to the commercial entity after a period of time. So for YP-389, it's two sister vessels. YP-387, it was also lost, and I don't necessarily know the exact circumstances for its loss, but YP-388 was returned back to commercial service. And so that's an interesting topic I'd like to get into, is the economic back and forth between the U.S. Navy and a commercial entity.
Well,
and
because
how
it
that
just,
was,
it just makes me wonder if it just didn't decimate the commercial fishing
And
industry.
that's-
'Cause, I mean, you
yeah.
need people to fish,
I was
and
thinking
have
about
some
that
food,
today.
yeah.
That would be a great continuation of this project, to see the economic ramifications of all these vessels being used, donated, and what its impact on the commercial community, and what that really reflected. And then with them coming back and see if there was a rise and fall in either prices or stocks. So that's another project that maybe someone will pick up on, or maybe a continuation of mine.
Cool. Thank you very much.
No, thank you.
That last question is interesting because during war, nations build more ships, and war is that rude test of technology. And sometimes we see World War II as being that transitional period from steam to diesel. And so what happened at the end of the Second World War is, with all of that extra building, you ended up with all these ships you didn't need anymore because they're not being used for warfare. And so people who wanted to purchase, it worked in reverse. You had war vessels, smaller patrol craft that could then get converted into trawlers that were probably better technologies, steel hulls, diesel vessels. And so while these were temporary conversions, the people that had these vessels bought from them had the option to buy potentially better vessels and convert them into other purposes. So it's sort of an interesting flip.
Yeah.
I should also say, John, does this go live? Does this get recorded for posterity, the question session?
Yes, this will be.
Oh, okay. I was just going to say that the primary investigator for the NOAA project, Joe Hoyt, made me record the depth charges on the Bedfordshire. So.
Yeah, just a short question. I don't know if you'll know the answer, but do you know the approximate speed capability of the trawlers?
They're about 10 knots,
About 10?
which is about the same cruising speed for a convoy to be
Right.
operationally workable.
Yeah, because something I remember reading was, at least early on, one of the issues was they couldn't set the depth charge too shallow because it was doing damage to the
Absolutely, I
trawler,
can
the
see
drive
that.
gear and so on.
Absolutely, that would definitely be an influencing factor. But yeah, it was about a 10 knot speed, and that's what you'd be working with in a convoy as well. So again, operationally they worked very well, just fit into that role as a escort.
Do you have any idea the effectiveness of their patrolling, if they've sunk U-boats? Seems like a lot of them were sunk by U-boats themselves during engagement.
Unfortunately, there was a lot of whale sightings that were misrepresented. Then, an interesting thing about their effectiveness is that they had the radio, and that was probably their most effective tool, was being out on the water, being there, and that would influence the way the U-boat itself operated.
Okay.
So if prior to these converted vessels being on the water, a U-boat had a lot of opportunity to move in and out of an area relatively quickly because it wasn't populated by these boats.
Right.
So the effectiveness was really in their just being there.
Their presence.
Their
yeah.
presence, absolutely. I don't have a recorded. Well, actually, I take that back. There was a British vessel that did, quote unquote, record a U-boat kill
Okay.
in British waters. I don't know the actual vessel type, but I could look that back up. But overall, their effectiveness is just in strength and numbers and altering their presence,
I gotcha.
U-boat presence
Okay.
in that way.
Thank you.
I should say that if anyone's online right now can hear me and would like to ask any questions, go for it. There's a little lag in the broadcast, so it'll pop up on my screen here and I can ask them. I have a question. Your models, they're very pretty and they spin around and stuff, and they're very colourful. But how much time, like how accurate are these things? What kind of effort goes into making them?
So for these models to be, we'll talk about this one. So each vessel had a varying degree of historical background information. Fortunately for, say, YP389, I knew exactly what the conversion process was. It was there was a detailed listing that was held in the archives that told how much the deck gun cost, where it was put, and there was like a plan for it. Flip that over with the 2 British vessels, there's no record of that. So I had to go through anecdotal letters and just pick and pull from different resources that didn't necessarily state how much. And so I had to infer a lot of that information. What I didn't include in any of these slides were the procurement of builder's plans, and that was really necessary to get accurate, detailed information about length, about location of especially the original features. Like for Cohasset, again, you have to know, length, overall length, but specific features within the interior that were listed inside the building, the builder's plans about where certain features were located. But overall, it was a mishmash of picking or finding and locating information. And so I did have to do a lot of inference, but these pictures were really helpful in that I knew that there was going to be a deck gun at the bow. So there is I would say they're 70 to 80% accurate in the scaling within this modeling program. It's called Rhinoceros 3D modeling, and you can set it to be very accurate within millimeters, but this is in a scale of feet. So it is relatively accurate within the modeling program.
Do we know how many U-boats were patrolling around and where they were patrolling? And
Yes, we do. Thankfully, I guess there weren't that many at the very beginning. So at the outset of when the U.S. was first getting into the war, following Pearl Harbor, there was Operation Pockenschlag, and I'm totally butchered that. It's a German pronunciation, but it's in English it's transferred to Operation Drumbeat, and that included 6 U-boats that were in the initial wave of U-boats coming to the East Coast and working their way across the North Atlantic down from Canada into East coastal waters. So there were 6 in the first invasion, you could say. Only 5 made it across. 1 had to turn back due to mechanical failure. But we do know through very detailed U-boat records of how many were operational, where and when, at different stages of the war. At any really given time, there'd be 4 or 5 maybe operating off the East Coast. But it was the fact that they were here really got everyone up in arms. You didn't know necessarily where they were at. As technology advanced, and the increase in numbers of military vessels, converted vessels out on the water, their ability to really be effective shot way down, especially with air cover. Air cover could easily come in and fly out and all up and down the coast. Cherry Point's a great example of where they were stationed to come in to do effective work. So yeah, we do have a record of different time periods of when they were here. Awesome.
Well, if there aren't any other questions, thank you very much for coming. Next month we're changing a little bit. The last 2 presentations have been on World War II. We'll revisit this in later months, but next month we're going to have a student come in to talk about his research on North Carolina's whaling industry and the archaeology of whaling. I don't have the date in front of me, David.
I think it's April 2nd.
April 2nd? It's on that one. April 2nd. So that's a Thursday, I believe, a different day. But as I mentioned before, if you are down Hatteras Way at 11 o'clock, that same lecture will be down at the graveyard of the Atlantic Museum, and then we'll have a 6 p.m. lecture here again, and you can always watch online too.
April 2nd.
April 2nd, yep.
We do have one question online.
Oh, one question online. You may have to read it.
It
Something.
says, personally, what got Will so interested in researching converted vessels and why are they important historically?
Well, I have to thank my thesis advisor for at least broaching the topic. I had no idea, really, coming into the East Carolina Maritime Studies program about converted trawlers. I was really interested in submarines from World War II, U-boats. And so getting into the program, we know that there's this thesis that's hanging over everyone's head. And so when finding a source to really jump into, I was really interested in World War II, and this was a great opportunity to learn and research something that I had no idea about. And it kind of goes beyond these three trawlers. That just the Battle of the Atlantic campaign in itself was such an influential piece of World War II history that's not necessarily broadcast in the same way like D-Day or other events that we all know. But it was just as important to the success of the United States and the Allies in World War II. So that was directly influential, I would say. My Dr. Richards helped me pick out that topic. But again, going back to just the importance of the sacrifice that these volunteers and men from different countries helped Americans in their own territorial waters, the sacrifice that they gave to help defeat Germans. So it's a very.
One more question online. I don't know if you can see it on your iPad there.
No, John.
And, if you could please repeat the question for the audience here online. Notice there aren't site plans for all the vessels. Are there plans to create these, Will?
The question, Will, is there aren't site plans for all the vessels. Are there plans to create site plans for all the vessels?
I would say probably not. Only in that that it would be very difficult to get to YP389 as an individual to do an actual on-site recording. The technology that we have today to map, and there's actually 3D technology that we can use and employ on top of an ROV that not only just gives us footage and photographs, but able to produce a 3D movable image that would be much more accurate than my own unsteady hand drawing. The one that would actually be very interesting for me to go to would be Senator Duhamel, only in that it's really accessible, it's shallow, you wouldn't necessarily need advanced diving techniques. You could take a few people down at the same time and really knock out the vessel and stuff. Just because there's not that much left, it would be relatively easy as well. And that would be on my list of priority targets, I would say.
The last thing to mention is if anyone's interested in pursuing maritime historical research or archaeological training, we do it here at CSI in partnership with ECU and NOAA's Monitor National Marine Sanctuary. If you're interested, we have some flyers here on our NAS training initiative. We've got a class coming up in the next couple of weeks. It's open to the public. If any of you are interested, I'd love to talk to you about it afterwards. But again, thanks, Will.
No, thank you
for coming.
everyone for your questions, and thank you.
Thanks, Will.
Thank you.